And so we continue with the silliest of timelines. Trump has now threatened to impose tariffs on Europe in his efforts to induce a sale of Greenland to the United States, specifically 10% blanket tariffs on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland beginning February 1st. And if I have my math right, yep, that is a classic 2-week deadline. Past that, the tariffs will ramp up to 25% on June 1st if there is still no sale. I have left his Truth Social post on screen so you can read the rest of it if you want to, but it is not worth spending further time on. Now, I know that everyone's first reaction is to bust out the Mexican food and call it a day. But if you peel back a layer and look into what is happening within DC politics, there is a much firmer reason to describe this as a bluff, and nakedly so. Thus, I will begin today's video by explaining what is happening over at the Supreme Court, before pivoting to the deeper puzzle. Presumably, everyone over in European capitals is aware of the ongoing legal proceedings. Presumably, everyone in the White House knows that they know. And thus, we will turn the focus onto the public's response to the situation, and how this is furthering an underlying goal over at the Pentagon. Okay, as a bit of a preface here, and I understand that this is easy to overlook, but the Trump administration still operates under the auspices of the US Constitution. Of course, the administration's lawyers like to take a very liberal interpretation of the powers that they are afforded. And yes, that is probably the last time that I will use liberal to describe them in any context. Now, Trump's White House is not the first to act this way. Back in my day, it was the same rallying cry against the George W. Bush administration. But Trump goes even further, to the point that Bush officials find it off-putting. Indeed, Trump et al. Will wait until a court mandates that they back down. And at least so far, the administration complies with those legal orders. The reason I needed to begin with that preface is that the Greenland tariffs have a legal basis, as interpreted by the administration. Article 1 of the Constitution covers the legislative branch, and as we rifle on over to Section 8, we learn that, quote, Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, and to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Beyond learning that the Founding Fathers had the same preference for capital letters as the sitting president does, and also learning that they hated the Oxford comma, which, come to think of it, makes sense given that they just revolted against Britain. The basic point is that Congress gets to set taxes. Now, with an important caveat that we will circle back to later, Congress can delegate that authority to the executive branch. And that brings us to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short. Basically, this is Congress recognizing that using a deliberative body is not always the best way to coerce foreign opponents, so the president can do that instead. Regarding international trade, the act empowers the president with a lot of verbs: to investigate, regulate, direct, compel, nullify, void, prevent, and prohibit. This is the legal basis that the Trump administration has offered for all of the tariffs that we have talked about over the last year, and presumably it will be the same story as it relates to Greenland. Of course, not everyone agrees that this is a legitimate legal rationale. Last year, the case Learning Resources v. Trump was brought to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were made, you will remember, on the 5th of November. To spoil what followed, the court was skeptical of the administration's argument. To get more granular, there were 3 issues. First, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act requires an emergency to invoke. Trump's lawyers cited 2 emergencies previously: the fentanyl epidemic and trade deficits. Both of these had the problem of being long-lasting and pre-existing issues. The United States has not had a trade surplus since Gerald Ford was president, while the fentanyl epidemic goes back to the tail end of Obama's administration. This calls into question the emergency timing. The Trump administration also describes Arctic security as an emergency situation, so presumably it will be the same story here. But there is no publicly available evidence to indicate that there are presently any foreign threats, particularly involving Russia or China. The Arctic will become increasingly important over the next decade, and emergencies may happen then, but we are not there yet. Moreover, it is especially problematic for this argument that these tariffs are only being levied on European allies, and not on Russia or China over the same security concern. That said, this is still the least problematic part of the administration's argument. The Supreme Court historically defers to the executive branch on matters of international security, and they may fall that way again here. That is not to say that the Supreme Court will side with Trump overall, just that there are deeper problems. Actually, the most problematic part is that the act does not explicitly grant the president the power to levy a tax. Recall that there were a ton of verbs in the text, but tax, tariff, and impose, as in a duty, were none of them. This was the subject of the bulk of oral arguments. Trump's Solicitor General pled his case. Quote, "The phrase regulate importation plainly embraces tariffs, which are among the most traditional and direct methods of regulating importation." The tariffs' opponents countered that, quote, "Tariffs are taxes. They take dollars from Americans' pockets and deposit them in the U.S. Treasury. It is simply implausible that in enacting IEEPA, Congress handed the president the power to overhaul the entire tariff system." The justices seem sympathetic to the opponent's argument. Amy Coney Barrett asked, quote, "Can you point to any other place in the code or any other time in history where that phrase together, regulate importation, has been used to confer tariff-imposing authority?" Trump's lawyer had no response, perhaps telling given how the act has been around for half a century. Another consideration here is that the Supreme Court's rule of thumb is to default to the explicit text in cases of major policies. For example, if Trump were to use the IEEPA to narrowly apply a tariff that only affected one person for $100, then the Supreme Court may pass on the issue. The fact that we even have this video tells you that the tariffs in question are nothing of the sort. They have dominated multiple news cycles. We have a Liberation Day named after them. Trump was even throwing hats to the crowd to celebrate. The final bit is that Justice Neil Gorsuch was preoccupied with whether the entirety of the IEEPA was legal. Congress can delegate authority, but they cannot abrogate their responsibility. Undoing the act requires the president's support, which will never happen, or a supermajority of support in Congress, which is rarely feasible. It is possible that you will have one justice vote to completely eliminate the law. Now, as a political scientist, I am here to remind you that the Supreme Court is a set of political actors. And while they often couch their policy choices in terms of legal theories, ultimately they are choosing policies in a political context. Currently, there are 3 liberals and 6 conservatives on the court. But John Roberts is a relative moderate interested in preserving the power of the court. Coney Barrett was seemingly unimpressed, and Gorsuch took a much larger swing. Even if one of them ultimately pulls out, you still have a majority against the tariffs. Unlike reluctant conservatives in Congress worried about getting primaried, Supreme Court justices have lifetime appointments and are therefore much better able to vote their preference. Does that guarantee that the tariffs will disappear soon? No. Many expected the court to issue a ruling in December. That did not happen, and we are now in the back half of January, still without hearing anything. Kavanaugh, in particular, wondered why the IEEPA would give the president the ability to block trade, but not tax it, given that infinite taxation is a full block, and that more moderate positions use less presidential power. It is worth noting that the betting odds put the Supreme Court rejecting the tariffs at 65%. That seems a little low to me, but bear in mind that even things with a 25% chance of happening are unremarkable when they do happen. In fact, they occur about a quarter of the time. One last thing to keep in mind here is that the Supreme Court's ruling is a function of what it observes Trump doing with Greenland. The justices can internalize the ongoing concerns and react accordingly. In other words, maybe the 5th vote is on the fence, sees Trump continuing to test the limits of the IEEPA, and then decides to shut it down before it gets even worse. Okay, that was a long preamble, but it was all building up to a greater puzzle. What I said is not news for folks sitting in European capitals. They have been keeping a close eye on the case for months, because the trade policy matters a great deal aside from what is happening now with Greenland. Presumably, the White House knows that Europe knows this. Thus, the White House can also infer that Europe is not going to buckle to any tariff threats that are likely to fall apart in short order. Never mind that the tariffs are not massively large, to the point where Europe would face substantial hardship by not conceding. And indeed, European leaders quickly responded by writing social media posts that more or less said, "LOL no," but in more diplomatic language. So, what the heck is the administration thinking here? Well, ask yourself two questions. Which countries are under sanction threat, and what has the modal response to this been from European voters? On the first question, if I had not already told you the 8 targets, but I did tell you that the United States was about to levy sanctions, which country would you think would be the target? Probably just Denmark. Denmark is the country that owns the island. But it is not just Denmark. It is the United Kingdom, and Germany, and France, and the Netherlands, and Norway, and Sweden, and Finland. In other words, it is the collection of countries that might contribute security forces to the island. A country like Estonia, which has declared support for Denmark but is not an Arctic nation, has a tiny navy, and is otherwise sidetracked by having to defend the border with Russia, is not under sanctions target. Meanwhile, what has been the modal response from voters of the targeted countries? 1. Anger that Trump is doing something silly. 2. Resolve to not back down. And 3. A push to contribute security forces to the island. We therefore seem to find ourselves in the usual situation. Trump threatens tariffs with a 2-week deadline. What usually happens from here is that the target scrambles to make an effort to appear to be complying with an underlying White House goal. When the deadline arrives, the White House backs down but claims a victory in having moved the opposing policy. And usually something does happen, even if it is nowhere near the White House's claimed goal. Nonetheless, that is the origin of the taco reputation. Maybe it will be different this time, but the tariffs are self-harming. The administration is aware of it to some extent. P.S. Has anyone checked on Rubio in the last 24 hours? And so the threats have more bark than bite. Compare that to what the administration has done kinetically, where the United States can inflict damage to the opponent at disproportionately high rates. Much less tacoing on that front. To be clear, I cannot begin to claim to know exactly what is going on in Trump's mind. I can speculate, but that is the extent of things. Please do not at me when things go off the rails for yet another reason. Trump certainly would love to buy Greenland if Denmark somehow loses its mind and sells. Trump invading Greenland would set off a domestic crisis inside of the United States like none of us has seen in our lifetimes. It would also be really silly to instigate a public spat over Greenland before doing it, rather than, just doing it. But what I am really here to tell you is that plenty of people inside of the Pentagon have long sought Europe to invest more in the region. And what is happening rhetorically is not matching what is long-run feasible, given all sorts of congressional constraints, never mind the ability of the next administration to undo whatever executive orders Trump puts into place. In contrast, how Europe is responding is matching those long-run Pentagon goals. Do with that information what you will. Think about what it means if Trump is not crafting policy, but rather is pushed in directions by his advisors until they get something that they want. Also ask yourself whether accomplishing this goal is worth upsetting major trade partners and inducing their populations to start boycotting your goods. As for me, I am once again going to the Winchester, having a nice cold pint, and waiting for this to all blow over. Meanwhile, in case you missed me crash a $2,000 military drone as I learned some of the critical problems facing Western drone manufacturers, check out this video. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.